A distant gunshot still echoed in Michael Turner's mind, though the war was over and he now stood in a quiet American town. His 3 children clung to him, afraid he might vanish. Behind him, a door slammed shut with a hiss, erasing all memory. Yet in his pocket, a crumpled envelope beat like a second heart, holding the truth this town had buried, demanding to be unearthed. A heavy summer noon in small-town America, the sun beat down on empty streets like fire. On the roof of a faded 2-story house, the glare was so sharp it made the windows look like sheets of light. In the kitchen, the smell of stale coffee mixed with the heat, pressing in from all sides, like the room itself was melting under both the weather and the tension. From the living room came the storm, voices no longer held back, no longer just the small, everyday complaints. These were words sharpened by years of resentment, now swung like blades. In the corner, the soldier stood frozen. His hand locked around a ceramic mug, knuckles white. Every word felt like a nail driven straight into his back, spelling out the truth he didn't want to face. He wasn't wanted here anymore, not in the house that used to be called his family's. The old wall clock ticked on, steady and cold, not caring what was tearing apart beneath it. A thin shaft of sunlight cut through the window above the sink, lighting up the dust like something out of place. He drew a breath, coffee gone sour, wood floor carrying the scent of age, and it stabbed at memory. Everything familiar, and yet so distant, like he was a stranger trespassing in his own home. He'd known the chaos of war, the snap of bullets, the screams, the ground shaking under explosions. Out there, at least, he had purpose, keep a man alive, keep the line from breaking. But here, in this small kitchen, the voices of family carried a weight far heavier than gunfire. No smoke, no bombs, just words he couldn't fight off. The mug trembled in his hand. He didn't dare set it down, afraid even the sound of porcelain against wood would shatter what little was left. His eyes fixed on the wall where an old wedding photo hung. The woman in the picture smiled, as if watching him. That smile had once been his anchor. Now it closed in around his chest like a fist. She was gone, and all that remained were 3 kids and a man who never learned how to live without her. The voices outside climbed sharper, bouncing off walls, mixing with the suffocating heat until the air itself seemed too thick to breathe. In that moment, he understood, whatever place he'd had in this home, it was gone. Sweat traced down his temple, slid to his neck. He didn't wipe it away. Let it stay, because at least it was real, more real than the promises that had already broken. His broad shoulders, once steady under a 50-pound pack in the desert, trembled now not from battle, but from being cornered in his own kitchen. A chair scraped hard in the other room, feet thudded heavy across the floor. He closed his eyes a second, the sound pulling him back to the desert, to the ticking clock before a blast. Only this time, there was no bomb, just words ready to cut the last thread tying him here. The thought came bitter, in war, you had orders, a way to fall back, a map that pointed somewhere. Here, there was no order, no map. Just the pounding voices, and him waiting for it to end. A dry gust slipped through the window crack, nudging the curtain. Outside, the world carried on, sunlight, errands, laughter on sidewalks. Only inside this house did everything collapse. That was the sting, to feel abandoned not in battle, but in peace, while the rest of the country lived its ordinary day. The voices faltered for a breath, as if even the speaker felt their own words hit too hard. But the pause was brief, and the storm rose again. His lips pressed tight. He knew when that door swung open and the noon sun cut in, it would be over. He and the kids would be pushed out, into the blinding heat, with nowhere to hold on. At last, he set the mug down. The soft clink was dry, final, like a closing line on years of swallowing pain. And in that glaring summer light, he saw the truth clear as anything, some battles cut deeper than bullets. And he had just lost one right there, in his own kitchen. In the doorway, the 3 kids pressed into each other like a clutch of baby birds without their mother. The shadow from the living room flickered across their faces, their wide eyes full of fear, too young to grasp the cruelty of the words they'd just heard, but old enough to feel something heavy was about to fall. And it had to do with their father, the only shield they had left between themselves and the wide, unforgiving world outside. Ethan, the oldest, barely 10, tried to stand in front of his brother and sister, a thin little shield against something he couldn't stop. His shoulders trembled, but his eyes kept searching the kitchen for his father, as if asking in silence, "We're still safe, right?" Sophie, just 7, clung to her little brother Ben, only 4. Her cheek pressed into his hair, arms tightening now and then like even the slightest wind might carry him away. Ben didn't yet understand what it meant to be cast aside. His big round eyes just wandered, then fixed on his father's frame standing motionless in the kitchen, so still it was almost frightening. The arguing rolled on from the living room like waves crashing, pounding into their young minds. To grown-ups, those were cold accusations. To children, it was just a storm without a name, tearing apart what little safety they had. Sophie pressed her face deeper into Ben's hair, whispering broken sounds that barely held together, like a clumsy lullaby. Ethan's hand brushed against the wall by the doorway, where their mother's wedding photo still hung. His small fingers traced the wooden frame, as if trying to find warmth from someone long gone. For just a moment, the soldier turned his head and caught his son's eyes. There was no blame there, just an unspoken question: "Can you hold us together?" He didn't answer. But in the weight of his stare, he sent a truth the kids couldn't yet read: he would never leave them, but this house, this family, was about to leave all 4 of them. Outside, the noon sun cut through the hallway window like a blade, slicing the shadow in two. The light spilled across their faces, making them blink against the glare. For a heartbeat, it looked like a painting: 3 children pressed close, backs to the doorway, eyes locked on their father, while behind them, a door was closing. The hinges groaned, rough and final. The front door, so often swung open for visitors and family, slammed shut behind them like a sentence that needed no words. Silence fell heavier than any accusation. The ceiling fan rattled, cicadas buzzed out in the yard, and all of it blended into a dull hum over a house that once held laughter. The soldier stepped out of the kitchen and laid his calloused hand on his son's shoulder. Ethan looked up, saw the red in his father's eyes that had faced down war and come home alive, but now carried defeat on their own soil. Sophie still clutched her brother tight, eyes wet, blinking fast as if not to lose the moment. Little Ben reached out his hand to his father's, gripping hard, afraid it might disappear. No one spoke. Everything came through in smaller things: a squeeze of the hand, a nod, a long glance. Those little gestures, in silence, were the only thread holding the 4 of them together. From the second that door shut, they no longer belonged to the house. They only belonged to each other. Sunlight leaked across the wooden floor, a long strip of gold. Dust floated in the beam, drifting without direction. The soldier bent down, pulled his children into his arms. It wasn't hurried, it wasn't dramatic, just slow, steady, protective. In that embrace there was sweat, sundust, and the stale trace of coffee on his hands. The kids tucked themselves against his chest, eyes closed, as if to say, "As long as we're here, the world hasn't fully turned its back." A car rumbled past outside, fading quick. The town carried on its shopping, lawnmowers, kids splashing at the park. But inside that house, 4 people had just been cut off from what used to be called family. That contrast made the loneliness sharper, as if the whole world had left them standing on the edge. The door had closed, no words needed. The soldier drew a long breath, his back straight but his chest hollow. In front of him, 3 trembling children huddled like small candles flickering against the wind. He knew everything had changed now. No more roof to call home. No more kin to lean on. Only the road ahead, empty, uncertain, but theirs alone. He held them tighter once more, then slowly let go so they could walk beside him. In that harsh summer light, under the merciless noon sun, the shadows of the 4 of them stretched long across the floor, merging with the last streak of daylight spilling in from the porch. The verdict was sealed. Yet in those thin, fragile outlines, something still refused to die: a small flame, waiting to be kept alive. The porch was blazing, the white sun beating down like fire, making the bricks underfoot burn hot enough to sting. On that narrow strip of shade, 4 figures stood with nowhere to go. A battered suitcase sat off to the side, a couple of warped plastic bags stretched thin at the handles, and a few stuffed animals so worn their insides showed through. It didn't look like luggage for a trip. It looked like the scraps left behind after being thrown out. The youngest tilted his head up, eyes wet in the harsh light, whispering something so soft even the wind swallowed it. No one answered. The father stood tall, back straight but eyes down, as if he couldn't find words that might soothe. The older two clung together, small hands slick with sweat, nails pressing into skin to make sure they hadn't slipped away from him just yet. A sudden gust swept through. Old bills scattered from a loose stack, spinning across the porch before lifting high into the hot air. Faded numbers, dry words about debt and payment, now just scraps twisting in the wind, like accusations that wouldn't settle. They fluttered in front of the four of them, then dropped along the walkway, reminders that this wasn't about losing space, it was about being branded a burden. The father bent down, picked one up. Ink smeared, coffee stained, but the word payment still printed bold. He held it longer than he needed to, then let it slip free, carried off again. A small motion, but his face showed the sting of another cut no one could see. Ethan, the oldest, bent to pick up a ragged teddy bear and passed it to his sister. Sophie pulled it tight against her chest, as if it was the only thing left untouched from the life they'd known. Ben crouched by the suitcase, kicking at the hot bricks, his knees shaking from heat and weariness. Too young to grasp the change, all he felt was the unease in his father's breath and the quick, hidden tears of his sister. From inside, the box fan kept spinning, its steady hum a sound of normal life. But to the four on the porch, it was foreign, like noise from a world they no longer belonged to. Behind the closed door, the shadows stayed still. No one stepped out. No blessing, no goodbye. Just silence echoing back, the house now an empty shell that had pushed them out like strangers. The father dragged the suitcase, its wheels shrieking across the hard brick. The sound scraped the heat itself, sharp and grating. The bags rustled against each other, making a noise that felt as labored as breath. Their shadows stretched across the porch, wavering in the punishing light, their outlines fragile, almost breaking apart. He looked down the street, so quiet he could hear the cicadas in the trees across the road. White houses stood still, shutters drawn, porches hung with baskets of flowers. No one looked out. No one asked. The town pretended not to notice a family had just been cast out. That silence was a bit colder than any words could. Sophie shifted the bag on her arm, the plastic cutting into her skin until her hand turned red. Ethan bent under the weight of a frayed backpack, the straps close to giving way. Awkward motions, but determined, like they both knew they had to grow up in a single afternoon. Ben rubbed his eyes, lips moving without sound, only a choked noise escaping, as if trying to call for his mother. The father bent and lifted Ben, arms shaking as he held the boy close. His back was soaked through with sweat, but he kept the child against his chest, holding on to what little still felt whole. A long breath left him, heavy as if the sky itself pressed down. In that moment, he felt it clear, he hadn't just been abandoned by family, but by the town, by the country that had once promised to stand by those who came home. A truck rolled past, tires grinding on the blistering road. The driver glanced their way, just a flick, then sped off, leaving behind dust and an engine's roar that swallowed the silence. The four figures remained, a dark smudge against the blinding sun. The iron gate of the house rattled in the wind, creaking like something worn out and forgotten. The father gave the house one last look at the curtain still shifting in the breeze, the same window where once a woman he loved used to wait for him. It was over. The slammed door hadn't just closed a home. It had closed his last thin hope of shelter. He turned, dragging the suitcase down the steps. The four shadows left the porch, walking the narrow path away, leaving behind a house now nothing but an empty shell. Their footsteps cracked against the burning bricks, each one dry, final, echoing toward a road with no clear end. And the wind rose again, tossing the tattered bills high, ghosts in the daylight whispering the same truth: they didn't belong here anymore. The heavy grind of metal cut through the silence, pulling them out of that breathless void. Across the street, a garage door inched upward, the smell of oil drifting out, bicycles leaning sideways, garden soil stacked in bags. The neighbor stood there, mud still on her gloves, work shirt streaked with dirt, frozen for a moment at the sight of the four figures huddled on the porch. The noon sun caught her hair, but her eyes settled on the scuffed suitcase, the torn plastic bags, and three kids clutching their father. Surprise flickered, then faded, replaced by a steady calm. No long questions, no pity. Just one clear line, spoken low but carrying across the empty street. Come to my house. Storm's coming. Her hand stretched out, soil clinging to her palm. No fuss, no show of charity, no pretty words. Just a simple gesture, like someone opening a door for a lost traveler, enough to give them shade, a place out of the burning sun. The father froze. His jaw tightened, then slackened, as if he couldn't believe what he'd just heard. After so many months of refusals and turned eyes, that plain invitation felt foreign, like a rope tossed into deep water. Ethan blinked, glancing up at him, waiting for a nod. Sophie clutched her teddy bear, her small hands trembling. Ben buried his face in his father's shoulder, mumbling sounds too soft to catch. The world around them stayed quiet, cicadas buzzing in the yard, papers spinning up off the ground, circling like restless ghosts. The neighbor didn't move. Her arm stayed out, patient, steady, as if this act of shelter was nothing unusual. At last, the father drew a breath. His step lifted from the hot bricks, the suitcase wheels scraping a tired note behind him. They crossed the narrow street, heat rising off the asphalt, the light so bright their shadows stretched and shook until they touched the woman's. As they drew close, she peeled off her gloves, balled them up, stuffed them into her pocket, then slid the garage door wider, making space. The cool shade inside felt like an unseen embrace. The cicadas still sang outside, but softer now. A breeze slipped through, carrying the smell of damp soil and lumber. Above, the sky still burned, but gray clouds were already forming on the horizon. The father set the suitcase down on the cement floor, his breathing slow, heavy. He didn't speak thanks, his lips pressed shut, as if words wouldn't fit. The children stayed close, taking in the shade like it was air they'd been starving for. The woman pulled out a few folding chairs, set them neatly, and gave a nod toward them. No need for explanation, no questions. Just small, solid actions, a chair unfolding with a click, a plastic jug of water with the cap already loosened. Ethan was first to reach for a cup, his eyes fixed on his father, afraid to move without him. Sophie set her teddy in her lap, touched the cold cup like it was sacred, lips moving in a whisper. Ben nestled closer to his father, reaching out with a shaky hand that spilled water down his fingers. The woman crouched, steadying the cup, wiping the spill with the corner of her shirt, never saying a word. In that shade, the four of them seemed, for the moment, free of the invisible verdict that had just been handed down. They still had no place to go, still carried the fear of being unwanted, but at least for now there was a roof, a hand that didn't accuse, didn't turn them away. Not salvation, maybe. But a breath. The father lifted his eyes to the wide-open garage door. Outside, the sun still scorched the street. But here, under this simple roof, he felt something different. Not pity. Just plain kindness, quiet and unadorned. And in the tired rhythm of his own breathing, he heard it clear, a small hope, starting to take root. That night, the neighbor's wooden house became a shelter for the four of them. On the creaking floor, a thin mattress was laid down, just big enough for the three kids to curl into one another. They drifted off quickly, like small birds worn out after a storm. Their breathing rose and fell together, soft but hurried, carrying the weight of a day that had stripped them of the place they once called home. The father didn't sleep. He sat on a low chair by the window, his shirt still stained dark with sweat. Outside, the streetlight threw a weak yellow haze onto the empty road, light too faint to chase off the dark, only making it deeper. His shadow stretched across the floorboards, tilted and thin, like a man wandering without a place to stop. A night breeze slipped through the crack in the frame, carrying the damp smell of earth and rotting leaves. He bowed his head, hands locked tight, and without warning he was back in the hospital room 2 years earlier. The sting of antiseptic, the steady hiss of the ventilator, the flat white glow from overhead lamps. She lay there, hollowed out but still somehow gentle in her eyes. He remembered her last breath. So short he didn't notice it until the hand in his had gone cold. That was when he understood a door had closed, and emptiness rushed in. The room felt too big, and he felt small, almost absurd, sitting beside a body that had finally let go of pain, leaving him behind with burdens he couldn't even name yet. Tonight, that memory came back sharp. He could almost hear the ventilator's rhythm under the wind outside. His chest tightened. His hand opened and closed, reaching for warmth that wasn't there anymore. Only the chill of wood and damp night air pressed back. On the mattress, Sophie shifted, reaching for her teddy bear. Ethan tugged the thin blanket closer to her side, while Ben, mouth parted in sleep, clung to his sister's hand. Watching them, he saw the shape of their mother flicker, as though she were still there, touching each forehead, whispering them to sleep. His vision blurred, but he didn't cry. The tears had dried out in that hospital room, leaving only an emptiness nothing could fill. He rose, stepped softly to the mattress, and crouched beside them. He pulled the corner of the blanket up over Ben's legs, brushed a strand of hair off Sophie's face. The streetlight cast a pale glow across their faces, dim as candlelight. They slept, but the faint furrows in their brows stayed, marks of fear that hadn't faded yet. He knew then, since the moment that hand had slipped from his in the hospital, every weight had shifted onto his shoulders. And tired as he was, there was no choice but to carry it. Back at the window, he looked out at the old maple in the yard, its shadow thick and still. Rain hadn't come yet, but the air pressed heavily. He remembered the funeral, the leaves falling that day, clinging to his shoes as if trying to hold him back. People had told him, be strong, for the children. At the time it sounded like comfort. Later, he understood, it wasn't advice. It was a sentence. Strength wasn't an option, it was the only way to keep going. He leaned his head against the wooden frame, eyes half closed. The night insects drummed in the distance, steady, hollow, like a clock marking emptiness. With each beat, he remembered her hand, the softness of it, now only in memory. He felt abandoned, not only by death but by kin who had, just that day, called him and his children a burden. Despair circled in. He felt his life had no reason left to stretch forward. His wife gone, family turned away, the town indifferent. Only those 3 sleeping faces kept him from falling under. In their small, unknowing way, they gave him air again, reminding him it wasn't all over. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of rain. The streetlight shimmered in the rising damp, glowing and dimming like a tired heartbeat. He let out a long breath, pressing his rough hand to the window frame, the tremor small but there. He knew he'd hit bottom. And yet, from the bottom, a thought slipped in, maybe, somewhere, another hand might reach out, like it had that afternoon. The night dragged on. The old clock in the next room ticked steady, one beat after another. The children slept soundly in the dark. He sat there, staring into the void, torn between the memory of a hand that had slipped away and the comfort of 3 small breaths rising and falling nearby. In the quiet of that wooden house, a fragile hope stirred. Thin as smoke in the dark, but enough to keep him upright for one more day. After the army, there was no parade, no band, just a long stretch of empty road that felt like fog pressing down on a town half asleep. He came back with legs that still burned on damp days, old wounds smoldering in his bones like coals that never went out. On paper, he was a decorated veteran. In real life, he was just a man chasing odd jobs. Some days there was work, some days there wasn't. That small benefits card sat in his wallet, bringing in just enough each month to keep them breathing, never enough to build anything steady. The kids grew up in that in-between, shoes rest-rung with new laces instead of replaced, clothes patched again and again, dinners stretched thin with extra broth so everyone had a share. At night, the pain in his leg kept him awake, a sharp ache that reached clear to the bone. He stifled his groans, afraid to wake the kids. Still, sometimes Ethan would stir, whispering, "Dad, does it hurt again?" He'd just rub his boy's head, stay quiet, and turn to the wall so the tears could fall unseen. Other nights it was Ben's fever, his small body trembling, breath quick and ragged. The father sat through it, swapping cool towels, eyes raw with worry. No one to share the load, no wife's hand to take the next shift. Just him, listening to the clock mark each second, every tick wearing his patience thinner. At dawn, he'd carry the sweat-soaked pajamas to a basin, plunge them into cold water. The splash on the cement stung his cracked hands. When he wrung the fabric out, the smell of fever medicine and cooling pads clung to it, pulling him back to hospital rooms he'd rather forget. That smell always cut deep. His wife used to stand over the same basin, washing, hanging clothes under the porch, her thin hands patient, steady. Now it was just him, hunched in the draft. Sometimes he'd freeze, waiting for her voice to call from the kitchen, but the house answered with silence. He'd kept a few of her shirts, fabric worn soft, still carrying the faint sting of antiseptic. Every fold brought back the memory of her hands slipping from his. Some days he hung them in the sun, not to air them out, but to breathe them in, to pretend she was still nearby. But when the light faded, the shirts only told the truth. She was gone, and with her went the only partner he had in carrying the weight. It was the little things that carved the loss deeper than the funeral ever did, snapping pills in half to make them last, stitching the seams of Ethan's old backpack for another year of school. Every small act is a reminder. One less set of chopsticks at dinner. An empty chair at the table. A bed too wide and cold at night. Work outside was never steady. Some days he hauled lumber on a site, sweat soaking his back, his leg trembling under the weight, still lifting more than he should. Other days he raked yards, stooping low though his spine already screamed. The pay was thin, but he brought it home, set it on the table like it was a medal, proof he'd earned them another carton of milk. In the world's turning back, the war inside him had become his private burden. No one else heard the explosions that still rang in his skull, no one else felt the cold sweat soaking him when the dreams came back. The kids only saw a father who startled in the night, who sat staring into nothing. They didn't understand it. They just stayed close, filling in the empty space their mother left. Each morning at school drop-off, he stood back, watching the three of them disappear into the crowd. When they waved, he smiled. But inside, he knew it was an act, a father playing strong. Truth was, he never knew how much longer he could hold it together. Those days strung out endlessly, patchwork jobs, the pain grinding on, that thin benefits card, a hollow house. Every detail, from a bloodstain on gauze to the smell clinging to an old shirt. Cut another notch into the ledger of loss. And in the quiet of the neighbor's home that night, all of it washed back over him. He'd fought battles overseas, but this one, the fight with want, with loneliness, with the weight of everything, this one was breaking him slow. Still, as he sat there in the dark, he held on. Because on the mattress just feet away, 3 children slept. And they were the only reason he hadn't let go. One quiet evening, with the first cold winds of winter slipping through the trees outside, the soldier sat alone in a narrow room. His 3 children were asleep on a thin mattress by the wall, their steady breathing mixing with the tick of an old clock. A weak desk lamp threw yellow light across the wooden floor, patchy like old scars. He decided to clean out the old army pack he'd carried home from war but had rarely dared to open. The bag was worn, the green canvas faded, the straps frayed from years of use. He set it down on the floor, his rough hands tracing the zipper as it rasped open. Inside lay small things worthless to anyone else, but to him, each piece held a lifetime, a folded, battered map, a lighter with the engraving long rubbed down, a few yellowed photos, and an old army jacket his wife used to wear on chilly nights. He lifted the jacket to his face. Even after all this time, it still carried a trace of the past, the sharp bite of antiseptic from her hospital days, mixed with the faint soap she used at home. The smell caught in his chest. Sitting still, his hand slipped into the pocket. His fingers touched something stiff, thicker than cloth. He pulled out an envelope, dusty, edges frayed, but still sealed. He froze. The envelope sat in his palm like it had been waiting for this moment all along. His heart slowed, each beat heavy, like a distant drum. After all these years, why now? He laid it on the table, staring at it as though it were a stranger in the room. The lamplight revealed its creases, the water stains, the faded yellow blotches. He didn't open it right away. His hand rested on top, afraid that once he did, everything might disappear or change forever. Across the room, Sophie stirred in her sleep. Ethan pulled Ben close, an instinct he'd carried since their mother passed. Their breathing, fragile but steady, pulled him back to the present. He thought, maybe this envelope held something about her last days, or some memory she had left behind. He dragged a chair over, sat down. His fingers traced the edge of the paper, careful, like touching an old wound. When the seal tore, it wasn't a smell that came out, but a feeling like a locked door in his mind had cracked open. Inside was a folded letter and a stack of papers. He lifted the letter first. The handwriting was familiar, crooked, but strong. He knew it right away, Ryan Campbell, his old brother in arms. Ryan, who had died in that last battle in Afghanistan, right in front of him. He remembered the moment clearly, Ryan shoving him out of the line of fire, then falling himself. A death that scarred more than just his body. His vision blurred. Years had passed, but that name had never faded. He drew a long breath and began to read. Mike, if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it back. Don't grieve for me. I chose this, and you know that. You gave me a chance to settle my debt as a man, and now I want to repay you. My family set up a trust, with your name as the beneficiary. Don't turn it away. Use it to rebuild your life. And if you can, use it to help the others too. You've earned it. The ink had run in places, but every word landed like a voice in the silent room. His throat tightened, gripping the letter as Ryan's face came back, the reckless grin, the laugh that cut through gunfire, and the last moment of blood and smoke. He set the letter down and opened the papers. The numbers made him blink. The trust held hundreds of millions. He read it again, then again. His heart hammered, the room seeming to tilt around him. It couldn't be real. He'd been living on scraps, counting out dollars to buy milk, stretching every check. And here, before him, was a fortune he'd never dreamed of. He didn't shout, didn't smile. Instead, the tears came, slow, heavy, the first true tears since his wife's funeral. Not out of pain, but relief. For the first time in years, life didn't feel like it had fully turned its back. A hand had reached for him, across time, through blood and brotherhood. He folded the papers back, pressed them to his chest, eyes shut tight. In the dark, Ryan's face appeared, his voice echoing, "You were the best of us. Don't let that die." A strong gust rattled the window, shaking the lamp. The light flickered, his shadow stretching long, trembling like a man standing at a crossroads. He knew nothing would be the same from here on. But more than that, he had a reason now. He looked over at his children, still sleeping, their faces carrying the day's weariness. He whispered to them, though no sound came out, "From now on, you'll have a real home. A future." That night, in a small room, an old envelope opened not just a secret fortune, but a door to hope. A quiet turning point, no flashbulbs, no witnesses, just a father, 3 children, and the dark. And it was enough to change everything, a spark glowing in the cold house, lighting corners that had been dark for far too long. The desk lamp flickered, his shadow stretched long across the wall, like a man just climbing out of a pit. The letter lay open on the table, the handwriting tilted, ink smeared into stains. He read the lines again, carving each word into his memory, "Use it to do good, for me." It wasn't just a message. It was the last order of a fallen soldier, the will of a brother bound by blood and fire. He set the paper down and covered his face with both hands. It wasn't the money, though the numbers on the page were beyond belief. It was the weight behind them. The dead wanted him to live. The man who fell had given him a new duty. In his chest, the cold wind of the battlefield returned, explosions echoing in his head, Ryan's body in the dust flashing clear as day. He didn't sleep that night. Sitting by the window, watching the streetlight sputter, he felt himself being pulled out of the darkness he'd lived in for years. But there was no joy. Only one heavy question: what was he supposed to do with it? Across the room, the children slept curled together, small and fragile. Their breaths, their soft turning, the murmured calls for their mother in dreams, each sound pierced him. He could take the money and give them everything: a decent house, new clothes, a future without fear. But Ryan's words cut sharp in his mind: don't keep it for yourself. Use it to do good. Faces came back to him, other vets he'd seen at the clinic in town. Eyes dulled with fatigue, hands shaking as they signed for prescriptions. Men sitting outside, waiting for work calls that never came. Some with no family left. Some slept on benches, hugging their packs like it was all they had. Those faces merged with Ryan's words, pushing him toward one conclusion. This money wasn't only for his 4 walls. It had to flow wider, to lift up the ones who had stood in the fire like he and Ryan once did. By the time daylight broke through the window, he hadn't closed his eyes. His own were bloodshot, but the weight in his chest had eased some. No longer did he see just a borrowed room, a watered-down meal, a stack of unpaid bills. He saw something else: a path, faint but real, a project, a place, a roof for those left behind. He leaned back in the chair and let out a long breath. Across the table, the old envelope still sat. But it wasn't just old paper anymore. It was new orders. A different kind of battle, no rifles this time, but bricks and mortar, warm meals, the eyes of children. A battle to rebuild. When the kids woke, he served them the last of the porridge. Sophie, half whispering, asked, "Dad, did you cry last night?" He only rubbed her head, saying nothing. But inside, he promised. No more nights they'd go to bed hungry, and no more soldiers would die alone if he could help it. That afternoon, standing on the porch, he looked down the empty street as the wind tossed a few yellow leaves. For the first time in years, his steps felt lighter. Still sore, still uneven, but every stride carried a new weight, the weight of duty and of hope. The next morning, with the sun barely pushing through the trees, he stepped out onto the street holding a paper bag close to his chest. Nobody knew what was inside, just a thin man in a faded shirt, shoes worn down at the heels. In a small town like this, he was just another familiar figure walking by, same as any other day when he'd go looking for work or stop at the store for discount groceries. But today his stride was different. It wasn't aimless. It felt like he was headed to a place he'd been meant to reach for a long time. The law office sat on the corner, brick walls, an old wooden door, a sign so faded it barely read anymore. No shine to it, but inside it was clean, still, and quiet. He pushed the door open. A middle-aged man looked up from a stack of papers, nodded. He didn't bother with introductions, just set the bag on the desk and slid out the worn envelope and thick packet. "This is everything," he said, his voice low, still shaky. The lawyer opened the file, eyes moving fast across stamps, signatures, seals. Silence stretched out. Then came a simple nod. Glasses off, eyes steady. "It's legal. All of it." Just a few words, but they shook him like the ground had moved. He sat down hard, hands on his knees to keep from trembling. Outside, life went on. Truck brakes squealed, birds called, kids shouted on their way to school. The world was the same. But for him, a man who once stood in firefights, it felt like he'd stepped into a reality so unreal it hurt his chest. The lawyer added, "This money is enough for you to live on for the rest of your life. But how you use it, that'll define who you are." He lowered his head. In his heart, Ryan's words came back clear as a bell, "Use it to do good, for me." He didn't need long to decide. "I want to set up a fund. Not for myself. For other vets." The words came out like breath, unplanned, unpolished, almost as if Ryan had spoken them through him. And so Hope for Vets was born. Just a plain name, scribbled on a scrap of paper, Hope for Veterans. Nothing flashy, no promises of grandeur. It started small, like a seed in a calloused hand pressed into hard soil. But that seed carried a vow, a memory of battle, and the kind of brotherhood that never fades. Day one, the organization was just him. No office, no staff. Just one old soldier, 3 kids, and a promise. He rented a small room upstairs in an old commercial building, with a window facing Main Street. Second-hand tables and chairs from the flea market. A wooden board by the door with hand-painted letters, "Hope for Vets." People walked past, glanced, moved on. Nobody knew behind that door sat both a fortune and a mission. At night, he stayed in that empty room, listening to the wind whistle through a crack in the window frame. On the desk, a cold cup of coffee, a stack of papers, and Ryan's letter. He read it again, then scribbled rough notes: affordable housing for homeless vets, job training for the unemployed, scholarships for their kids. Plenty of ideas, no foundation yet, just fragile belief. The next day, he brought Ethan, Sophie, and Ben to the room. They stacked cardboard boxes into makeshift chairs, pinned their doodles on the bare walls. Their laughter echoed, giving the place a heartbeat. He looked at them, their eyes shining in the empty space, and thought, hope doesn't start with a bank account. It starts here, in this kind of laughter. He handwrote letters to old comrades, explaining his plan. Some never answered. A few said yes, let's meet. The first meeting, just 3 men around a beat-up table, sipping weak coffee. They spoke about rent, about medicine, about jobs. He didn't make grand promises. Just said, I'm not rich. But I have a fund. And I want it for us. Silence, then nods. From that morning in the lawyer's office, things began to flow, slow but steady. He no longer felt like the man left behind. He felt like a bridge. Hands that once trembled reaching out for help now found each other, held firm. Late at night, back in the borrowed house, he watched his children sleep and whispered, "Tomorrow will be different." Not wealth, not revenge. Just a tomorrow that meant something. And so, in a small town, in a second-floor room nobody noticed, Hope for Vets began. No parade, no ribbon cutting. Just a quiet spark. But to a soldier who had lost everything, that spark was already enough to warm a life and maybe, just maybe, many more. The rented room on Main Street wasn't much bigger than an old classroom. The walls were stained, the ceiling cracked in places, and when the wind slipped through, the seams groaned faintly. He pushed a battered wooden desk up against the window. On top sat a frayed corkboard and a second-hand coffee maker. Each morning, when he turned the key and stepped in, the smell of damp wood and old books rose up, so familiar it reminded him of a field post years ago, nothing perfect, but enough to start from. He'd sit for hours, scribbling lines on paper, crossing them out, writing again. No gunfire, no orders crackling over the radio. Just a cooling cup of coffee and the steady tap of a pencil on the desk. Still, the rhythm was the same, a mission that demanded patience, endurance. The kids drifted in and out. Ethan would tuck himself into a corner, reading the cast-off books his father picked up from the library's discard pile. Sophie took leftover sheets of paper, drawing flowers and pinning them to the wall, softening the gray space with color. Ben, too small to sit still, would spin on the squeaky chair until he nodded off. Their breathing, their eyes on him, that was what kept the empty room from feeling cold. On the first day, he pinned up a notice, "Hope for Vets, a place for veterans to find hope again." The handwriting was shaky, plain. Passers-by glanced in and kept walking. But for him, that paper was like a small flag planted on new ground. The days that followed, he mailed letters to churches, the Veterans Hall, a few old brothers in arms. No answers came. Still, he unlocked the door each morning, wiped down the desk, brewed coffee, and waited. In the afternoons, when sunlight slanted through the glass, he'd stand by the window and watch the street below, people heading home from work, kids spilling out of school. Life moving on, while he stood apart. Then he'd remember Ryan's letter, and sit back down. A week later, there was a knock. An older vet stepped in, shoulders stooped, cap in hand. He sat, spoke slowly about losing his home after his wife passed. The soldier listened, didn't interrupt. When the story was done, he slid across a voucher for 1 month's rent. Just a small sum, but the old man's eyes filled like he'd been handed back to the sky. From that moment, the second-floor room stopped being just a place to sit in silence. It became somewhere men came with their stories, with the weight they had nowhere else to set down. He couldn't fix everything. But he listened. And sometimes listening was a kind of saving, too. At night, locking the door, he'd look back inside the corkboard with new notes pinned up, the desk speckled with coffee, Sophie's drawings taped to the wall. A small room, but it had a heartbeat. And for the first time in years, he felt he wasn't useless. The little cafe on the corner glowed with soft yellow light, lamps hanging low over tables darkened by years of use. That afternoon he chose a seat in the back, near the window, where he could watch the leaves drop from the trees outside. An espresso sat in front of him, steam curling upward, the smell of roasted beans thick in the air, steadying his pulse. He knew this meeting wouldn't be easy, but he came anyway. The door opened, the bell above it chimed. They walked in, the man tugging at his collar, the woman carrying a worn leather bag, her face calm but her eyes tight with calculation. They saw him at once, came to his table, and sat across from him. No embrace. No, "How are the kids?" Just the scrape of chairs and a silence heavy enough to crowd the room. He waited. They ordered something quickly, then the man placed both hands flat on the table, fingers tapping. His voice was clipped, dry. "You should think about the costs we've carried. Raising those kids wasn't a small thing." Not once did he use the word family. No softness, just ledger talk. The woman added, her tone lower but sharper, "Now that you've got money, you should return the favor. You can't just walk away. Each word dropped cold, like stones into water. He listened, his hand wrapped tight around the cup, the heat burning through his skin. He'd stood in firefights, heard men scream as rounds tore past. But the chill that came from these two cut deeper than anything he'd felt in combat. He drew in a breath, kept his voice steady. "You told us we were a burden. You shut the door. And now you want to settle accounts?" The man looked down, stirred his coffee. The woman clutched her bag tighter, lips pressed thin. Silence stretched. The cafe was nearly empty, just the hiss of the espresso machine and the faint clink of spoons against cups. Outside the window, autumn leaves spun in the wind. He watched them fall, remembered that first night on the porch with his kids, nothing but the wind and a handful of bills flying through the air. The memory rose up, but it didn't crush him anymore. He had a place to stand now. He had that second-floor room, the small sign that read "Hope for Vets," the faces of old soldiers who came there to share their weight. He wasn't hollow anymore. He set his cup down, his voice calm, steadier than he expected. "Family doesn't measure itself in bills. If you want to call us a debt, that debt doesn't belong to me." They didn't answer, just glanced at each other before looking away. The air in the cafe grew thick, though the espresso smelled as rich as ever. He stood, left a few bills for his drink, and walked out without another word. The bell above the door rang again. Outside, the late sun fell across his shoulders, cold but clear. Behind him, the two sat still under the dim light, their hands restless on the table. But he, stepping into the flow of the street, knew for certain, he and his children had moved into another chapter, one no demand, no calculation could touch. The espresso in front of him was still giving off steam, but the taste of coffee suddenly felt flat in that moment. The soldier hadn't answered yet when his oldest boy, just 10 years old, set his soda can down on the table. The sound of metal hitting wood was soft, but it landed like a hammer. His voice shook, not loud, but steady enough that the whole cafe seemed to stop and listen. "If you want to talk about costs, then count the nights I stayed up with Dad after Mom died." No more spoons stirring in nearby cups. The espresso machine went quiet, like it was holding its breath. The man and woman across the table froze, their eyes shifting toward the boy. But he didn't look away, didn't lower his head. His young face, steady beyond his years, looked straight at the two people who once called him and his siblings a burden. The soldier said nothing. He only tilted his head, eyes on his son. Inside him, pride tangled with pain. Pain that his boy had to grow up too fast. Pride that the truth came from his son's mouth, simple, undeniable. His little sister gripped her cookie tight, eyes wet but refusing to cry. The youngest didn't fully understand, only leaned his small head against his brother's shoulder. Those tiny gestures, in the heavy air, flickered like a small flame keeping the room from going completely dark. The man across the table cleared his throat, trying to hide his unease. His hand reached for his cup but couldn't lift it. The woman opened her mouth, but her lips trembled, the words stuck in her throat. The silence thickened, heavy as the dust on the cafe's old walls. The soldier stayed quiet, letting his son's words spread on their own. Outside the window, the late sun slanted down, yellow leaves trembling across the tabletop, as if they too were witnesses to this moment no one had expected. The boy spoke again, his voice still trembling but steady. "Dad doesn't keep score with us. He taught me how to fold blankets, fold shirts, and cook noodles when we were hungry. He was there every night. You don't charge money for your family." The man sucked in a breath, his face flushing before he dropped his eyes to the table. The woman's grip tightened on her bag, her gaze flickering now, no longer cold and sharp. Neither spoke. Not because they agreed, but because they had no way to fight the simple truth of a child. The soldier laid his rough hand on his son's shoulder, saying nothing. That touch was thanks, and a promise. He knew sometimes it's the children who end up speaking the strongest truths for the grown-ups. The cafe slowly found its rhythm again, spoons clinking, the door opening and shutting. But at that table, the air still held tight, like a wire pulled to the limit. The soldier stood, cleared the soda can and napkins. He didn't look back at the two across from him, only gave his son a small nod and agreement, an affirmation, "We've said enough." When the four of them stepped out, the door chime rang. Outside, the air was cooler, the late light stretching across the street. His steps felt lighter, not because the fight was over, but because he knew he wasn't alone. Through all the loss, he still had 3 kids beside him, braver than most adults. Inside, the two sat frozen under the yellow lamps, stuck with a silence they couldn't shake. A child's words had rattled them, not with anger, but with a truth they couldn't buy, couldn't demand. He didn't carry revenge in his heart. The pain from those years was too deep to turn into cheap payback. But he also wasn't about to let humility become an excuse for others to keep treating him and his kids like they didn't matter. At the next meeting, he sat calm, one hand resting on the scratch table, his voice slow and steady. He told them he'd pay off the debts weighing on their backs, but in return, they'd have to work at Hope for Vets. No medals, no titles, no special treatment. Just real work. The older eyes across from him blinked in shock. The man was used to contracts, numbers, and cocktail parties. The woman was used to pressed dresses and manicured nails. Neither had ever pictured themselves holding a hammer, chopping vegetables, or scrubbing floors like ordinary volunteers. The look in their eyes was the look of people who'd been handed a mountain after a lifetime of strolling smooth pavement. He didn't leave room for negotiation. "Family isn't measured in invoices," he said. "But if you want to talk about responsibility, then shoulder it with me. Not with money. With your hands." The little meeting room went still. Outside, cars passed, the wind whistled through a crack in the window. Ordinary sounds, suddenly distant. The man swallowed hard, face flushed at being forced down a rung. The woman clutched her bag tighter, her eyes flashing with defiance before softening into something closer to defeat. The first day they showed up at Hope for Vets, late fall rain streaked the windows. The man stood in the old woodshop, hands trembling around a hammer heavier than any pen he'd ever held. The raw smell of sawdust clung to his shirt, sharp and unpleasant. The boards wouldn't obey like subordinates once did. He drove a nail crooked, the tabletop tilting off to the side. Nobody laughed. The vets around him just watched, no mockery, just the plain truth, his hands knew nothing of the work. In the communal kitchen, the woman stood over a pile of celery. Fingers that once wore diamonds fumbled with a knife, cutting awkward, uneven slices. Tears ran down her cheeks, maybe from the onions, maybe from the humiliation. Cooking oil clung to her hair, garlic to her sleeves. The clatter of knives and the hiss of pans was a foreign language she'd never learned. He didn't hover over them, didn't bark corrections. He stayed back, stepping in only to adjust a hammer grip or show a small motion. He knew, if anger filled the room, it would all collapse again. This wasn't about shaming them, it was about letting them feel it, letting them learn by doing. On the third day, when the man stumbled and dropped a heavy plank, a younger vet, still limping from shrapnel, rushed over to help. "Careful, sir. That one's heavy," he said softly. No sarcasm, no bite. Just concern. The older man's eyes wavered, shame cutting deeper than any insult. By the 5th day, the woman pulled a tray of burnt bread from the oven. A silver-haired nurse who'd once worked field hospitals set a hand on her shoulder. "First tries are always rough. Try again. Don't be afraid." The words were gentle, but they steadied her trembling hands. Quietly, she set out a new tray and started over. The kids were there too. Ethan passed his grandfather a rag in the workshop, wiping sweat off his brow. Sophie giggled at the pile of butchered vegetables, then slid a plate of her own homemade cookies onto the counter without a word. Little Ben stuck a Band-Aid with a cartoon car on his grandmother's finger after she nicked herself. The kids weren't judging, they were just being kids. And somehow, that cut deeper than any lecture. He watched all of it, standing back like an outsider. But he knew what it meant. Those clumsy moments weren't humiliation, they were cracks in the walls of pride. And the more cracks appeared, the more light could seep in. By the end of each day, they left with stained clothes, messy hair, scratched up hands. Gone were the polished looks of old. What remained was fatigue, and something else, something more human. He knew the road was long. But at least they had taken the first step. He didn't call it revenge. He called it a fair trade. They'd once turned their backs, once tallied up family in dollars and cents. Now they'd have to learn to measure in sweat, in meals cooked for strangers, in chairs built with shaky hands. Only then would the debt start to be paid, not to him, but to their own conscience. In the beginning, it all felt like a clumsy play being acted out over and over. The sound of a hammer hitting wrong in the woodshop, each strike loud and sharp, only to leave a nail bent sideways, useless against the board. In the kitchen, loaves of bread came out burned black, smoke curling up and filling the air, forcing people nearby to quietly crack open a window. Hands that once signed contracts or wore silk gloves were now covered in small cuts, dotted with specks of red. Failure piled on failure, like a quiet punishment. The old man cursed under his breath when a plank split in two, then shut his mouth when he caught the kid's eyes on him. The old woman turned away when smoke rose from the oven, but Sophie's damp eyes reflected a simple truth: everything can be redone, even burnt bread. And alongside each failure, there was always another hand nearby. A young vet, limping on his prosthetic, picked up a crooked nail and set it straight. "Here, let me show you," he said. No judgment in his voice, just steady patience. The older man's face reddened, his grip tightening on the hammer like he had something to prove, but after a beat, he let go and watched the younger man's hands guide his. In the kitchen, a silver-haired woman who'd once been a battlefield nurse said gently, "First time's always rough. Just try again." The old woman bit her lip, bent over the wet vegetables, her knife still shaking, but the next cut came a little straighter than the last. The kids were there too, like clear little mirrors. Ethan dropped by the workshop after school, quietly handing his grandfather a rag, eyes free of judgment. Sophie, hair tied up in a hurry, slid one of her homemade cookies onto the counter and said casually, "If it burns, you just make it again." Little Ben ran up when his grandmother nicked her finger, pressing a cartoon band-aid onto her skin, clumsy but determined. Those small acts rippled out like stones tossed in water, touching the cracked edges of pride. The old man started complaining less, sometimes even stopping to listen when a vet showed him how to measure properly. The old woman stopped fussing over her clothes, leaning in instead when someone told her, "That soup smells just right." At night, back in the modest apartment Hope for Vets had set up, they sat slumped at the table. Their hands ached, knuckles raw from hammering nails that bent more often than they held. Backs sore from lifting boards, chopping vegetables, bending over stoves. Their clothes smelled faintly of sawdust and onions, a mix that clung even after washing. There were no chandeliers, no plush couches, no polished silverware. Just a yellow desk lamp on a scarred wooden table, throwing its tired glow into corners where shadows hunched low. They looked at each other, lines etched deep into their faces. No more blame, no sharp words left to throw. Only silence and the quiet acceptance that tomorrow, bruised and sore, they'd do it all again. The silence was not empty. It was full, the scrape of chair legs against old linoleum, the sigh of someone leaning back with weight they no longer carried with pride, the drip of a faucet that no one bothered to fix. These were not the sounds of defeat but of life, pared down to the bone, stripped of ornaments. In that rawness, something fragile but honest began to grow. The town started to notice, slowly, cautiously. People who had once bowed to their status, once whispered about Margaret's fine pearls and Robert's sharpsuits, now saw them in the shop, buying sacks of flour with their sleeves rolled up. They saw them in the yard, bent over broom handles, sweat beading along their temples. They saw them in the kitchen, hands dusted white with flour, shoulders stooped. Nobody laughed. Nobody clapped. The townsfolk simply nodded, that small tilt of the chin that means, "We see you. We'll wait and see if this holds." Their eyes held curiosity, a little pity, and maybe, just maybe, a flicker of hope that change was not just temporary. At nightfall, the soldier often lingered outside his small office, a hand braced against the doorframe, staring toward the workshop where lights still burned. From inside came the uneven ring of hammers striking nails, sometimes twice, sometimes 3 times before the wood held. The steady chop of knives against cutting boards. The shuffle of feet across sawdust-slick floors. He didn't step in. He didn't need to. He let those sounds tell the story. A story of change, slow but real, unfolding like a tired song repeating itself until it finally found the right tune. Every cut on their hands, every burned loaf pulled from the oven, these were not mistakes anymore. They were bricks being laid, rough and uneven, but solid all the same. Each failure chipped away a sliver of pride, each new attempt building a piece of foundation. Michael knew no one changes overnight. He knew scars of arrogance run as deep as scars of abandonment. But he also knew that if patience held long enough, cracks would widen into openings, and light would find its way through. And sure enough, there were small signs. When Robert bent to pick up a broken plank instead of tossing it aside, when Margaret wiped her tears with the back of her flour-dusted hand and kneaded fresh dough without complaint, these were the first real moments. Quiet, unannounced. No speeches, no fanfare. Just life, moving forward, like green shoots breaking through after a long winter. Hope for Vets had started out in a cramped little room with a few clumsy hands. Within months it spread like water running underground, unseen until it surfaced. Abandoned houses on the corner, the ones with busted windows and paint peeling in thick curls, began to change. A fresh coat of paint covered more than cracks in the wall. It covered the neglect that had whispered through those streets for years. The scrape of brooms, the thud of hammers, the rasp of saws all blended into a steady rhythm. By late afternoon, sunlight bounced off new tin roofs, bright enough to make the block feel like it had been given breath again. Michael often stood off to the side, quiet, watchful. He didn't bark orders, didn't give long speeches. He let the work speak. Robert, the same man who once closed his doors and turned his back, now carried long boards, shoulders trembling but steady, lips pressed in concentration. Margaret, who once lived in silk, now rinsed vegetables in an old aluminum tub, her hands spotted with burns from trial and error. They said little. They didn't need to. Work, more than words, told the truth. Dinner at night slowly became ritual. A big room, light, bare and low, a table pieced together from scavenged boards. A pot of soup steaming in the middle, bread sliced unevenly, a bowl of salad wilting slightly at the edges. People sat shoulder to shoulder, veterans, children, neighbors, strangers who wandered in because they smelled warmth and wanted to be near it. Sometimes there weren't enough chairs, some stood and ate leaning against walls. Nobody minded. What mattered was being there. Spoons clinked against bowls, voices rose and fell, children darted in circles around the table. Sometimes they spilled water, sometimes a bowl tipped. No one scolded. Hands reached quickly with napkins, cleaned it up, chuckled, and kept on. There were no tallies, no debts, no accounts kept. Only the quiet miracle of people gathered, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. One evening, Sophie brought Margaret a crooked little cookie she had baked herself. Margaret bit into it and, to everyone's surprise, laughed. It wasn't the brittle laugh of pride or performance. It was unguarded, spilling out like something long forgotten. Her eyes softened as she looked at her granddaughter, and something inside her cracked open. Down the table, Robert ladled more soup into the bowl of a young vet, the same one who had caught a slipping board for him weeks ago. They didn't trade words of thanks. Their eyes met briefly, and that was enough. The workshop, once filled with tense silence, changed too. The saws no longer screeched against wood like enemies. Their sound became background music for laughter, for the telling of old stories, for good-natured teasing when someone mismeasured a plank. Sawdust clung to everyone alike. On hair, on boots, on shoulders. No distinctions left. No one above or below. Just workers, fumbling but together. On weekends, the whole community showed up. They cleaned out old houses long left to rot. They painted doors pale blue, hung flower pots from porches. A veteran with a cane sat nearby, watching as walls once gray and lifeless found new color. Children swept yards with plastic brooms, sandals slapping in rhythm with the wind. Each action small. Together, monumental. It was not just renewal of buildings, it was renewal of trust, of faith that people could change, that the past did not dictate the future. Michael rarely spoke. He had learned, through war and loss, that words can be hollow when stretched too far. But one night, sitting on a porch that still smelled of fresh paint, listening to someone strum an old guitar, he felt the melody settle in his bones. It was plain, slow, imperfect. But it told their story better than any speech could. Hope for Vets did not need signs or slogans. It lived in these moments, in paint drying on old boards, in flour dust on wrinkled hands, in laughter echoing against walls newly alive. Someone said once, "We're rebuilding houses." Michael shook his head gently. They weren't just rebuilding houses. They were rebuilding trust. They were stitching together invisible threads, pulling people back into a fabric that had once torn. The hammering, the sweeping, the cooking, the laughter, it all worked quietly at the same task, making broken hearts whole enough to carry on. In the kitchen of Hope for Vets, the smell of flour and butter seeped into clothes, into hair, into skin. Margaret, who once sat in spotless kitchens where others did the work, now stood at a scarred wooden table, her blouse dusted with white. Beside her, Sophie showed her how to roll dough into small uneven balls. The child's hands were sticky and clumsy, but her eyes shone, serious with the weight of teaching. And for the first time, Margaret listened to someone smaller than herself, followed instructions, laughed when the dough flattened wrong. And in that laugh, the years of distance began to thin. Robert, in the yard, struggled with boards that bent under his weight. Ethan walked beside him, steadying the planks, nodding quietly when the cuts came straighter. No lectures passed, no scolding. Just a boy and a grandfather, sweat running down their foreheads, with dust clinging to their arms. The work was enough. Day by day, the change wasn't dramatic. No newspaper headlines marked it. No parades. But in the softened lines of Margaret's face, in the calluses forming on Robert's hands, in the ease with which Michael finally breathed, the evidence was there. And though the past remained a wound too deep to vanish, the sting began to ease. What began in silence became ritual, became rhythm, became community. And from a modest apartment, from flour-dusted tables and uneven chairs, from laughter around soup pots, a kind of hope grew steady, unshaken by pride, unbroken by shame. It was not the kind of hope found in speeches or grand gestures. It was the kind that settles deep into the marrow of ordinary life. And for the soldier, that was more than enough. The first tray was a disaster. The dough had spread into awkward puddles, edges charred black, sugar crystallized into bitter crust. The old woman frowned hard enough that her wrinkles seemed to deepen. Her instinct was to toss it, to erase the mistake before anyone saw. She had spent most of her life in spotless kitchens where someone else cooked, and failures were whisked away on silver trays before they even reached her eyes. But this time, she had no staff to hide it. Only her trembling hands, a hot oven, and 3 pairs of children's eyes watching with a strange kind of patience. Before she could move, Sophie giggled. She reached out, picked up the misshapen cookie, and bit into it without hesitation. Crumbs scattered down her shirt. "Still sweet, Grandma," she said, her mouth full, eyes bright. That one simple line, delivered without judgment, without mockery, was enough to make the old woman pause. Her hands stilled above the tray. For the first time in years, she did not measure her worth in perfection. She scooped up more flour, sighed once, and tried again. Nobody clapped. Nobody praised her effort. Instead, the children chewed with butter on their lips, their laughter bubbling up like small lights flickering in a dark room. It was not applause, but it was enough. Out back, Robert hunched over scraps of wood. His eyes, once sharp with numbers and contracts, struggled to follow the wavering line of a saw. He measured slowly, hammered slowly. Nails bent, boards split, angles betrayed him. His Suitenledger past had never trained him for this. He cursed under his breath, though softly, ashamed that even the hammer seemed to mock him. At last, a chair emerged, but it wobbled. One leg short, the back tilted like a bent spine. Michael stood a few feet away, hands clasped behind his back. He didn't laugh. He didn't correct. He had learned in the army that sometimes the hardest part of leadership was holding silence, letting a man stumble until he found his own balance. Ethan was the first to test it. Without hesitation, he sat down. The chair tipped sideways, almost spilling him to the ground. Instead of groaning, he burst out laughing, his voice high and clear. He pushed his feet against the floor to steady it, rocking it side to side like a carnival ride. His laughter carried into the yard, drawing Sophie and Ben, who joined in. The same children who once knew the sting of slammed doors now laughed at a crooked chair, as if it were the most joyful thing in the world. Something tightened in Robert's chest. His eyes stung. He looked away, blinking, embarrassed by the sudden rush of feeling. That laughter, unguarded and forgiving, was worth more than any contract he had ever signed. In the days that followed, he sanded edges, tightened bolts, measured twice instead of once. His back ached. Blisters swelled on his palms. He muttered through the pain, but every time he looked up, 3 small faces were watching. Not judging. Not demanding. Just watching, glowing like lanterns against the night. That expectation, wordless and steady, was enough to keep him at the bench. Inside, Margaret stopped frowning at burnt cookies too. When Sophie sprinkled powdered sugar over the ruined tray, turning the blackened lumps into something playful, she didn't scold. She smiled. The children clapped, not loudly, not out of obligation, but in their own way, by grabbing cookies with eager hands and devouring them, crumbs scattering across the floor. Their joy was payment enough. More valuable than the hollow applause of the cocktail parties she once hosted. One morning, little Ben waddled over with a crumpled piece of paper. He had drawn, in crooked lines, a large chair and a tray of cookies. Colors smeared outside the shapes. "Grandma's," he said, pointing at the tray. "Grandpa's," pointing at the chair. The meaning was clear. In his eyes, they weren't distant figures anymore. They were part of this place, as rooted as the cookies and chairs they made. Robert's second chair came out sturdy. The back was straight, the legs even. He tested it himself, lowering his body cautiously, waiting for the wobble that never came. He nodded once, quietly, and turned away, hiding the faint smile tugging at his lips. He didn't know Ethan was watching from the window, eyes shining as though he had just witnessed a victory greater than any medal. That night, the dining room glowed under a single bulb. On the table, a tray of fresh cookies steamed in the warm air, butter sweetening the room. The children laughed between bites, their cheeks flushed with delight. No one brought up the past. No one argued right or wrong. Michael sat at the head, eyes moving from the children's grins to the 2 old figures, one with hands powdered in flour, the other with palms rough from wood shavings. He breathed deeply. They had come a long way. Not to erase mistakes. Not to prove themselves. But to exist, together, in a community learning how to smile again. That afternoon, the sun stretched long across rows of freshly painted houses. Pale blues, soft yellows, cream whites. Nothing flashy. Just enough to make the street look alive again after too many silent seasons. The porches smelled of fresh lumber, their steps still sticky with paint. A few small geranium pots lined the rails, red blossoms bobbing gently in the wind. Children ran circles in the dust, sneakers leaving tracks on newly paved paths. Townsfolk gathered without being asked. No banners, no slogans. Just bodies standing shoulder to shoulder, arms crossed, eyes shining. Some carried food, a steaming pot of soup balanced between 2 hands, a tray of cookies laid out on a makeshift table built from leftover planks. The clink of a spoon against a pot echoed softly, mixing with the rustle of autumn leaves. Michael stepped forward. His shirt was old, his shoes worn thin. But his posture was straight, grounded like a rooted oak. He stopped in the center, eyes more on the houses than the crowd. His voice came low, steady, carrying just far enough. This is a promise kept from the battlefield. Nothing more. Silence spread through the crowd, not heavy but thick with understanding. Someone drew a sharp breath. A veteran leaning on crutches nodded faintly, lips pressed tight. Mothers bent to press their children closer. Their eyes glistened. That short sentence struck something buried, grief too long carried, hope too long starved. The keys were handed out quietly. No band played, no anthem rose. Just metal slipping into trembling hands. An old man clutched his key as though it weighed 100 pounds, his eyes cast down, knowing it opened more than a door. It opened a future. In another corner, a young mother pressed the cool metal into her child's palm. The boy's eyes widened at the jingle, as if holding a bell that marked the start of a new life. At the edge of the yard, Robert sat apart, palms still dusted with sawdust from the morning. He did not step forward, but pride shone unhidden in his eyes. Margaret carried her tray of cookies to the communal table, setting it down among the bread and soup. Then she slipped back into the crowd, letting the children hand them out. No one called them forward, no one praised them. And yet, in that silence, they felt lighter than they had in years. The laughter of children echoed down the street. Sawdust still clung to hair, flour-dusted sleeves. The air carried the smell of soup, the sweetness of butter. A street once abandoned now pulsed with life. And in that simple gathering, no banners, no trumpets, something stronger than ceremony was born, a quiet, steady trust that people, even broken people, could begin again. The sun dropped lower, casting gold across the new rooftops, glinting off the glass panes. The soldier stood at the edge of the light, fingers laced, saying nothing more. He let the laughter, the clatter of dishes, the patter of kids' feet fill the air. It was just a moment, but everyone they knew, here, no one was left behind. Those houses weren't only for shelter, they were proof that, even over scars, something strong and pure could take root. And so the handover ended. No speeches, no staged photographs. Just smiles, hands clasped, and the evening sun spilling down, lighting up a small corner of the street. As the evening light slanted low, folks were still gathered in the wide yard. Kids' voices chirped, spoons clinked faintly against the pot of soup now nearly empty, and the smell of butter cookies lingered in the air. The soldier figured the gathering was done, people would head home, leaving behind that row of fresh-painted walls glowing under the fading sun. But as he turned to go, a slow movement stirred the crowd. From the back row, his in-laws stepped forward. His father-in-law's hair was whiter than before, his mother-in-law's back bent, the two of them looking like weathered shadows beaten down by too many storms. Gone was the pride, gone the judgment in their eyes. All that was left were two hands laced tight together, trembling like they were afraid they might collapse. His father-in-law's voice cracked, each word forced out heavy but clear, "We were wrong." No excuses, no long wind-up. Just the admission, after too many silent years. His mother-in-law stood beside him, tears streaming freely now, no pretense left, no pride to guard. Her voice broke as she clutched his arm, "I'm sorry, sorry to you, and to the kids." The crowd went still. Only the rustle of dry leaves in the wind, a faint rattle against the windows of the cafe. Michael Turner stood there, his boots planted heavy on the worn tile floor, eyes blinking slowly as if to hold back the sting. He didn't rush forward, didn't reach out to steady them. He let the silence hang, long and uncomfortable, wanting to be sure those words were real, not just weakness in the moment. The weight of years balanced in that pause, grief, anger, the brittle shell of pride. And then, out of nowhere, the children moved before the adults could. Ethan stepped first, his small shoulders squared as if he'd rehearsed it in his mind, and grabbed hold of his grandfather's arm. His fingers clung tight, white at the knuckles. Sophie, with her dark hair loose and uncombed, pressed straight into her grandmother's chest, her cheek against tear-streaked fabric. Little Ben toddled last, slow and certain, and wrapped both arms around their knees, saying nothing, just pressing his face in like a kitten searching for warmth. No one told them to do it. But kids often know the truth quicker than grown-ups. They saw regret was real, and they answered with nothing but open arms. Applause broke out, hesitant at first. A few hands, scattered. Then the sound swelled like a wave rolling across the small cafe, wooden chairs creaking under the movement, silverware rattling faintly on the tables. It wasn't applause for an organization, or for the houses that had just been built. It was for that rare thing, the guts to bow one's head and whisper "I'm sorry" after years of silence. A different kind of courage, not measured on a battlefield, but in the kitchen of family life. Michael finally stepped closer. He rested a hand on Ethan's shoulder, his gaze steady, meeting the faded eyes of his in-laws. He didn't say the word forgiven. He didn't bring up the past, didn't rehearse the ledger of debts. Standing there quiet, rooted, not turning away, that was answer enough. In the last light of day, for generations touched, two old folks bowing their heads, one soldier standing still, and three children holding on with everything in them. Simple as it was, the image froze the crowd into silence. When the clapping ebbed, all that lingered was the long, easy sigh of people who had just witnessed something rare, real reconciliation, fragile and plain. Later, in the small house by the lake, the night carried a hush. Water lapped gently beyond the porch, the lake dark as oil under the moon. Inside, a soft yellow lamp stretched its glow across the rough wooden table. On it sat a chair the old man had built, uneven but sturdy, beside a plate of cookies his wife had baked that afternoon. The smell of warm butter tangled with the faint scent of cut wood, filling the house with a plain, familiar comfort. The family sat together. No one rushed into heavy talk. No one brought up the ceremony earlier. Only the quiet sounds of silverware tapping against plates, a chair sliding softly back. You could hear each breath, see glances exchanged like shy offerings. The old man's rough hand rested on the table, fingernails still rimmed with paint. His eyes wandered the room, the low ceiling, the children's drawings thumbtacked crooked to the wall, the window cracked to the lake breeze. Not the grand house he once kept, but somehow this place gave him a peace he hadn't tasted in years. The chair he'd built was a little off balance, but when Ethan sat in it, there was no creak, and the boy's eyes lit up as if he'd just claimed a throne. Across from him, the old woman kept fussing with the tablecloth, then carefully set down the cookies. Her hands trembled, not from anger, as before, but from worry that her batch might not be good enough. Yet when Sophie bit into one and beamed, "So good, Grandma," the old woman laughed out loud. It wasn't polished or rehearsed, it was raw, clumsy, and alive. That laugh bounced off the ceiling and fell back into her chest. For the first time in years, she felt lighter. Michael sat watching, shoulders easing down from years of holding tight. He didn't see stern figures anymore, but two old folks fumbling back into the role of parents, of grandparents. He didn't put words to it. Their presence at that table, in this small house, was change enough. Ethan quietly scooped more potatoes onto his grandfather's plate. Sophie chattered about the flowers behind the house, her voice bright and quick. Ben, mouth sticky with crumbs, leaned half asleep into his grandmother's arm. No one told them to behave this way, children simply sensed warmth returning, and answered in kind. The clock ticked steady. The lake breeze slipped through the screen. Michael lifted a glass of water, drank slowly. The heavy past remained, the war nights, the betrayals, the slammed doors. But here, at this table under yellow light, he felt life could grow again, even from torn soil. The old man cleared his throat, started to speak, faltered. At last, in a whisper rough with shame, he said, "I didn't think I'd ever sit here again." No one answered. But Sophie slid her small hand onto his, a reply deeper than words. Dinner ended in quiet comfort. Nobody named the old mistakes. Nobody pressed about the uncertain future. Yet the little house by the lake glowed with a light no lamp could cast. It came from the simple act of being there, sitting together, eating together, seeing each other with gentler eyes. Later, as Michael cleared dishes, he paused by the open window. The night air carried the cool scent of lake water, the soft lapping against the shore. He didn't call it reconciliation, didn't dare imagine a perfect family restored. He only knew this, for tonight, peace had found its way into the house, quiet, steady, clear as moonlight on still water. The soldier sat quietly. The kids' laughter carried through the small kitchen, mixed with the sound of a knife against the cutting board and a ladle stirring soup. His in-laws bent over the table, picking through greens, their movements slow but careful. Each leaf pulled from the stem, washed in clear water, laid neatly in the basket. Just ordinary gestures, but to him, it felt like something close to a miracle, two people who once turned their backs now helping him prepare a meal for the children. The meal itself was nothing fancy. A pot of potato soup, a plate of salad, a few cookies still warm with butter. No roast meat, no wine, no fancy dishes. But the air around the table was enough to make him feel lighter, like he had finally set down the weight he'd been carrying for years. His shoulders eased, his back no longer stiff like it had been standing at doors slammed in his face. He remembered the long nights in the service, his squad huddled around a single ration bar, splitting it under dim light. Simple meals, but full of shared struggle. Tonight, in this little kitchen, that same feeling returned. Warmth, born from the simple fact of not eating alone. Ethan leaned across the rough table, the sleeves of his shirt pushed back and damp with broth. He scooped another spoonful of potatoes onto Ben's plate, careful not to spill. The boy's hands were already sticky with crumbs, but his eyes glowed as if each small act of being cared for was a treasure in itself. Sophie, perched on the edge of her chair, chattered happily about the flowers she had planted out back, 2 rows of marigolds and a handful of seeds she wasn't sure would take. Her voice lifted and fell like a bird's song, filling the small dining room with something brighter than the dim bulb overhead. Ben didn't pay attention to words. He rolled a chunk of bread between his palms until it crumbled, his laughter soft and bubbling. His grandmother watched, her lips trembling as though they wanted to form words but couldn't. Finally, she reached out, her hand brushing over the boy's hair. The gesture was hesitant, shaky, but familiar, like an old habit rediscovered after being buried for too long. The boy leaned into the touch without thinking. He didn't need an explanation. Children rarely do. Robert, their grandfather, stayed quiet. His shoulders hunched as though decades of pride had been stripped away, leaving only the weight of age. Yet every so often, he leaned forward to refill a cup, the pitcher tilting in his clumsy, veined hands. Water spilled a little down the sides, dripping onto the table, but he wiped it quickly with his sleeve, saying nothing. No one laughed at him. No one scolded. The act itself, quiet, steady, present, was more than enough. Michael sat back, watching. The steam from the soup curled upward, carrying the scent of onions and thyme. He didn't need more apologies. He had learned long ago that some gaps can't be closed, some wounds don't heal smooth. War had taught him that. Marriage had taught him that. Family, too. He had scars that would never vanish, both inside and out. But here, with kids laughing and soup simmering and old hands busy with greens, he felt something shift. Not a miracle. Not redemption. Just the smallest belief that life could still go on. That forgiveness was possible, even if forgetting was not. Outside, the lake breeze carried in a cool dampness. It slipped through the window cracks, brushing across tired skin, stirring the curtain like a ghost passing by. Moonlight fell across the scarred wood of the table, highlighting every notch and groove carved by time. Michael's eyes followed those lines, his breath slowing. For the first time in years, he let himself sigh, not from exhaustion, not from despair, but from relief. A weight lifted, if only for tonight. The meal ended without ceremony. There were no toasts, no speeches. Just empty bowls scraped clean, the creak of wooden chairs pushing back across the floor. Sophie carried her drawing to the window sill. Ethan gathered the spoons, clattering them into a basin. Ben bolted for the porch, crumbs still clinging to his shirt. Their laughter spilled into the night, mixing with the steady drone of crickets outside. To Michael, it felt like a feast. Not because of the food, though the soup was warm and the bread thick, but because for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, he had a table where everyone sat together. That was the richness he thought he'd lost forever. The lake outside shimmered under moonlight. Michael stepped onto the porch, leaning against the worn rail. The air smelled of damp earth, pine, and the faint trace of wood smoke drifting from a neighbor's chimney. He heard the children chasing fireflies in the yard, their feet thudding against the soft ground. Their laughter rose in bursts, carrying across the water. Behind him, Robert sat heavy in his chair, rubbing at his palms as though the calluses surprised him. He had never earned calluses before. His life had been led with pens, not hammers. Margaret lingered in the doorway, her apron still dusted with flour. She held the empty tray that once carried cookies, staring at it as though it held more weight than porcelain should. Slowly, she set it aside and walked onto the porch, her steps uncertain, but present. No one spoke. The silence was not empty, it was full. The buzz of insects, the rhythmic slap of waves against the dock, the soft whistle of wind through reeds. And layered over it all, the breathing of those gathered, slow, steady, a quiet chorus of people who, for too long, had forgotten how to share air without resentment. Michael's mind drifted. He remembered barracks filled with the wheeze of soldiers too wounded to last the night. He remembered the day he returned home, only to find doors slammed, voices sharp, accusations heavy as stones. He had thought then that war's silence was easier than family's cruelty. And yet, here he was, sitting in a different kind of quiet. Not the silence of abandonment, but the silence of healing, a silence that allowed space, not emptiness. He turned and looked at his children. Ethan leaned against the porch post, eyes fixed on the lake, his face already carrying the lines of a boy forced to grow too soon. Sophie hummed softly to herself, her small hands folded in her lap. Ben slept where he had collapsed against his grandmother's arm, his chest rising and falling with the ease of trust. Michael studied that trust, fragile and luminous, and felt it anchor him more surely than any metal ever had. Margaret adjusted the blanket around Ben, her fingers trembling but precise. Robert shifted forward, clearing his throat as if to speak, then stopped. His eyes dropped to the boards under his feet. He reached for the pitcher again, pouring himself water, though his cup was already full. It wasn't about thirst. It was about doing something, anything, that let him remain at the table, remain useful. Michael understood. Forgiveness wasn't always about words. Sometimes it was in the simple persistence of showing up, refilling cups, baking cookies, sanding boards. He didn't need Robert to confess. He didn't need Margaret to beg. Their presence, clumsy but steady, was enough. The night wore on. The children returned, fireflies trapped gently in their cupped hands, their giggles soft as they watched the glow pulse on and off. Margaret smiled at the sight, her eyes wet. Robert leaned back, his chair creaking, but his posture loose for the first time in years. Michael stayed quiet, watching. He didn't want to break the spell with words. Later, when the children were tucked into blankets on the floor, when the last dishes had been rinsed in cold water, when only the lake and the insects made sound, Michael sat again at the table. He ran his hand over the wood, scarred and uneven, but strong enough to hold bowls, cups, elbows, laughter. Strong enough to hold them. He closed his eyes. For years, he had thought he'd lost everything, his wife, his home, his sense of belonging. Tonight, in this modest house by the lake, he realized he still had something left. Not perfection. Not even wholeness. But enough. A feast, he thought again. Enough to believe in tomorrow. Enough to let go of the breath he had held tight for so long. And with that thought, he exhaled long, steady, and free. In that moment, the past was still there, but it didn't weigh the same. He understood, healing doesn't come with grand declarations. It comes in small meals, in children's laughter, in old hands humbling themselves to pick through greens. And in that simplicity, he found a new seed of hope, small, but strong enough to last. The air had shifted. The crowd that had gathered for the house dedication ceremony, neighbors and townsfolk and veterans who'd all come to see this new chapter, felt the tremor ripple through them. For a long while, no one moved. Hats were held in still hands. Mothers pressed their children closer. And the only sound was the restless rustle of dry leaves blowing down Main Street, their edges scraping like paper against the pavement. Michael Turner stood there, his frame heavy in the last light of day, the weight of years pressing through his shoulders. He didn't rush forward. He didn't reach out to steady the old couple who had, after so long, broken open enough to weep in front of everyone. Instead, he let the silence sit, thick as dusk fog, wanting to be certain that what had just happened was real, not a fleeting crack in pride, not just weakness in the moment, but something truer. His eyes blinked slowly, the way a man blinks when memory and present blur together, when he isn't sure if he's dreaming. And then the children moved. It was never the adults who carried the courage first, it was the children. Ethan, his oldest, stepped forward as if something inside him had been waiting for this moment all along. He grabbed his grandfather's arm, his small fingers tightening with a strength that belied his size. Sophie followed, pressing her slim frame against her grandmother, her dark hair brushing against cheeks wet with tears. Little Ben toddled up last, slower but steady, his stubby arms circling both their knees. He said nothing, he didn't need to. He only pressed his face into them, the way a kitten buries itself in warmth, unthinking, instinctive. No one told them to go. But children sensed the truth quicker than grown-ups. They recognized the regret for what it was, and they answered with open arms. The applause began hesitantly. A few hands clapping, the sound scattered and shy, then others joined, the rhythm swelling like a tide. Soon it was the whole crowd, a wave of palms smacking together, voices catching in throats. But it wasn't applause for a program or a charity. It wasn't for the rows of fresh-painted houses that would soon shelter veterans and their families. It was for this. Two old people bowing their heads and asking for forgiveness, a soldier refusing to turn away, and children bridging the distance between them. It was for courage of another kind, not measured in battles fought overseas, but in the quiet, unglamorous war inside the home. Michael stepped closer then, only a single pace, but it was enough. He laid his hand on Ethan's shoulder, steadying the boy. His eyes lifted, meeting Robert and Margaret Davis's, his in-laws. He didn't speak the word forgiven. He didn't dredge up the catalogue of old wounds. He didn't have to. His presence there, his refusal to look away, his choice to stand with them instead of against them, that was answer enough. The light dipped low, shadows stretching long across the dirt lot. In that moment 4 generations touched, 2 elders bowing, 1 soldier standing quiet, 3 children clutching with all their might. The applause ebbed, giving way to something more profound. Silence, full and reverent, broken only by the deep, collective exhale of a crowd that had just witnessed something rare. Reconciliation, plain, fragile, but real. When the gathering finally dispersed, lanterns dimmed and chairs folded, Michael led his family back to the small house by the lake. The night wrapped around them like a soft blanket, dark and cool. The lake lay still as glass, reflecting slivers of starlight across its surface. Cicadas rasped from the tall grass, joined by the hum of crickets, their chorus carrying far into the woods. The porch light of the little house stretched a warm circle across the worn boards, just enough to carve out a haven against the vast dark. Inside, the air smelled of butter and sawdust. On the rough wooden table sat a chair Robert had finished only days earlier, its legs uneven but solid, and beside it, a plate of cookies Margaret had baked. The scent rose gently, warm and familiar, drifting through the cramped kitchen and into the living room. The family gathered around the table. No one rushed to fill the space with words. There was no grand speech, no rehearsed declaration of unity. Just the soft clink of silverware against plates, the scrape of a chair nudged into place, the sigh of wood settling under weight. In the pauses between, breaths could be heard, glances exchanged like small offerings. Robert's rough hand rested heavy on the tabletop, fingernails still stained with flecks of paint. His eyes wandered the room, the low ceiling, the children's drawings pinned crookedly on the wall, the window cracked open to let in the lake breeze. This wasn't the grand house he and Margaret had once kept, polished and proud, but there was something here that house had never offered, a kind of peace. The chair he'd built was clumsy, uneven, but when Ethan climbed onto it and it held firm, the boy's face lit with delight. It was, to him, a throne. Across the table, Margaret fussed with the tablecloth, tugging at its edges, then carefully placed the cookies in the center. Her hands trembled. Once, they had trembled with anger, fists clenched and voice sharp. Now they trembled with fear that her offering might not be enough. But when Sophie bit into one and smiled, "So good, Grandma," a laugh escaped Margaret's throat. It wasn't polished or guarded. It was raw, clumsy, and real. The sound bounced off the ceiling, fell back into her chest, and left her lighter than she'd felt in years. Michael sat at the head of the table, shoulders easing, eyes softening. He no longer saw stern judges in Robert and Margaret. He saw 2 old folks fumbling their way back into the roles they had abandoned. He didn't need to say it aloud, their presence here, at this humble table, was enough of an answer. Ethan scooped extra potatoes onto his grandfather's plate, quiet and thoughtful. Sophie chattered about the wildflowers blooming behind the house, her voice darting through the air like a sparrow. Ben leaned half asleep against his grandmother, crumbs sticking to his chin, content in her arms. No one had told them how to behave. Children simply sense warmth returning and respond in kind. The clock ticked steady on the wall. Outside, the lake breeze slipped through the screen door, cool and damp. Michael lifted a glass of water and drank slowly. The heavy past remained inside him, nights of war, betrayals, slammed doors, cruel words, but here, in this glow, he realized life could grow again. Even from soil torn apart, shoots of green could emerge. Robert cleared his throat, started to speak, faltered. At last, in a voice barely louder than the crickets, he said, "I didn't think I'd ever sit here again." No one answered. Words weren't needed. Sophie reached across the table, laid her small hand over his, her gesture speaking the only reply required. Dinner ended in quiet comfort. No one listed old grievances. No one spoke of distant futures. Yet the little house by the lake glowed with a light no lamp could cast. It came from the simple fact of being there, sitting together, eating together, seeing one another with gentler eyes. Later, as Michael carried dishes to the sink, he paused at the open window. Outside, the water lapped gently at the shore, the night air cool against his skin. He didn't call this reconciliation. He didn't dare pretend their family was whole again. But he knew one thing: peace had entered this house. Quiet, fragile, but real as the moonlight trembling across the lake. He leaned against the frame, listening to the night. He remembered his time in the barracks, when winter winds ripped through thin walls and he lay awake beside comrades whose breaths grew ragged, whose eyes dimmed before dawn. He remembered the homecoming, when jobs slipped away, when family doors closed. Those memories still lived inside him, etched like scars. Forgiveness hadn't erased them. But it had dulled their sting, softened their ache. Behind him, Sophie dropped her pencil. He bent, picked it up, placed it beside her sketchbook. She smiled without looking up. On the page, a crooked sun rose over uneven houses, windows glowing, flowers sprouting at their base. "That's our home," she said simply. No one corrected her shaky lines. To them, it was perfect. To Michael, it was a promise that life could continue, could bloom again. He smiled, a small curve of lips he hadn't felt in years. Life would still be hard. Pain would still come. But tonight, on this porch under fading cicadas, he felt something rare. Peace begins in the smallest of things. The night stretched on. No one hurried inside. Crickets played their steady chorus. The children's laughter rose and fell like sparks. And somewhere between those sounds, forgiveness found its place. Michael's thoughts drifted to his fallen comrade, the man who had shoved him out of harm's way, who had given Michael this chance at life. He had promised then to carry on, to make that sacrifice matter. Tonight, with his children tucked close, with his in-laws bowed and humbled, he understood, keeping kindness alive, however fragile, was part of that vow. A question rose inside him, lingering, almost whispered aloud. If it were you, if those who once turned away came seeking again, would you have the courage to open your heart? The question wasn't his alone. It belonged to anyone scarred by abandonment, anyone still carrying wounds. We all have them: a door slammed shut, an averted glance, a cruel word that cracked something inside. Forgiveness doesn't erase. But it can let us breathe again, lighter. He lifted his eyes to the sky. The wind skimmed across the lake, breaking the moon's reflection into silver ripples. The children laughed as a firefly wandered into the porch light, its glow floating like a fragile lantern in the dark. Proof that even in deepest night, light finds its way. The question hung in the air, unanswered. Each person, each reader, each witness would have to face it themselves. Could you? Would you? Dare you? Somewhere else tonight, perhaps in a cramped kitchen, or a dusty attic, or on another porch, someone was waiting for a second chance. Forgiveness doesn't undo what has been done. But it lets both the wounded and the wounding step forward. Michael looked around the porch once more. Ethan's steady gaze. Sophie's bent head over her drawing. Ben sleeping heavy in his grandmother's lap. Robert and Margaret nodding in shadows, weary but present. He placed his hand gently on Sophie's head, smoothing her hair. A small act. But it said everything: scars or not, they would walk on together. And so the frame closed. The chorus of insects outside carried on, steady and endless. Inside, the warm breath of a family filled the room. The soldier's story did not end in perfection. It ended in something more honest, in the courage to sit together again, in the light of forgiveness cracking through the dark, in the choice to open a heart instead of shutting it tight. And the question lingered still. If it were you, if the people who once turned their backs came looking again, would you have the courage to open your heart? The silence after was long enough for anyone listening to measure themselves against it. Long enough to search the dark, and maybe, just maybe, find a flicker of light strong enough to keep going.